97 soldiers. No reinforcements, no way out. 3 days trapped inside Forward Base Crimson while the enemy tightened the noose, and Commander Grant Hayes had already begun calculating how many body bags he would need. Then a woman walked through enemy lines alone. No rank, no unit, no official record that she had ever existed, just a rifle. And when she pulled the trigger for the first time, an enemy machine gun position vanished from the valley like it had never been there. Hayes had spent 23 years in uniform dismissing stories like this. He was about to eat every single word. If you want to know what happened next, subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because this is only the beginning. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, not the kind of rain that cools things down or gives soldiers something to complain about around a fire. This was cold, relentless, the kind that soaks through gear, turns dirt into sucking mud, and makes every surface a mirror that reflects nothing useful. It came down in long diagonal sheets across the Keldavar Valley, and it had been doing that since the moment Forward Base Crimson lost contact with the outside world. 72 hours. That was how long the base had been cut off. 72 hours since the enemy had closed the roads, destroyed the relay towers, and settled into the surrounding ridgelines with heavy weapons and the particular patience of fighters who knew they had already won. They weren't rushing. That was the part that frightened people most, the soldiers who sat in the dark listening to the rain and the distant movement of men who weren't in any hurry. An enemy in a hurry makes mistakes. An enemy that waits has already decided the outcome. 97 soldiers held the compound. They had food for maybe 4 more days. Medical supplies for 2. Ammunition was not the problem yet, but everyone inside the wire knew that math only worked if the enemy kept its distance. If they pushed, if they actually came through the perimeter, ammunition became irrelevant inside of 20 minutes. Commander Grant Hayes stood in the operations room, a reinforced concrete bunker that smelled of damp earth, generator exhaust, and the particular sourness of men who hadn't slept properly in days, and stared at a map that had stopped making sense 48 hours ago. The map showed roads that were no longer usable, radio frequencies that were jammed or destroyed, and extraction routes that the enemy had systematically sealed with a precision that still unsettled him. Whoever was running the siege on the other side knew what they were doing. Hayes was 51 years old. He had 23 years in uniform, multiple combat deployments, 2 commendations for valor, and a reputation within the officer corps for keeping his composure under pressure. He was the kind of man other men pointed to when they needed to believe someone had a handle on things. He projected calm the way some structures project weight, not deliberately, but inevitably, simply by virtue of what they were built from. Right now, alone in front of the map, with a cold cup of coffee going stale at his elbow, he was not calm. He was doing the math. Sergeant First Class Devlin Marsh came through the door in the particular way he always did, fast, purposeful, already talking before his boots fully cleared the threshold. "Sir, you need to come see this." Hayes didn't turn around immediately. "Tell me it's the relief column." "It's not the relief column." "Then give me 30 seconds." "Sir?" Marsh stopped. His voice had changed slightly, lost some of its operational flatness, taken on something Hayes couldn't immediately categorize. "You need to come see this now." Hayes turned. Marsh was standing there with an expression that the sergeant had never quite worn before. It wasn't fear. Marsh had been in worse situations than this, and fear had never really settled on his face in any legible way. This was something else, something closer to confusion, wearing the mask of professional composure. "What is it?" "Someone just came through the east perimeter." Hayes set down the coffee. "Our side or theirs?" "That's the thing, sir." Marsh paused a half-second too long. "She walked through their side." The east perimeter guard post was a sandbag position set into a cut in the outer wall, staffed by 2 soldiers who had been awake for going on 18 hours and were doing their best to watch a sector of ground that the rain had reduced to about 40 meters of useful visibility. Corporal Yates was at the scope when the figure emerged from the gray, and he later described it the same way every time anyone asked him, like she had just stepped out of the fog the way you step out of a hallway. No crawling, no crouching, no tactical movement that made any kind of recognizable sense. She was walking, not casually, purposeful, eyes forward, rifle slung across her back in a way that made it clear she wasn't about to reach for it, both hands visible and open. She was wearing civilian pattern rain gear over what might have been military-issue base layers, and she was absolutely soaked through. The mud went up to her knees. Yates had the good sense not to shoot her, mostly because his brain couldn't process a threat fast enough. He challenged her instead. Standard protocol. Both words of the challenge came out slightly louder than he intended. The woman stopped, looked at him directly, said, in a voice that was completely flat and completely controlled, "I need to speak to whoever is in command of this position, and I'd appreciate it if we moved quickly because I've been out in that for 14 hours and I need to get eyes on your perimeter layout before first light." Yates brought her inside. By the time Hayes arrived at the East Post, 3 other soldiers had gathered, all of them finding reasons to be near enough to see without being obvious about it. Word traveled fast in a small compound, especially when the word was strange. She was sitting on an ammunition crate, pulling off a soaked outer layer and wringing water out of it with the methodical efficiency of someone who had done that particular thing many times before. Up close, she looked to be somewhere in her late 30s, maybe early 40s. It was difficult to judge with certainty because her face had the kind of weathered quality that comes not from age, but from accumulated exposure, from too many nights outside in conditions that were not designed for human comfort. Dark hair, cut short and practical. Eyes that were gray or possibly green depending on the light, which was bad, and which she didn't seem to notice or mind. She had a long rifle in a drag bag set against the wall beside her, not slung, set down carefully, like you set down something that deserved care. Hayes looked at the rifle, then at her. "Commander Grant Hayes," he said, not offering it as a greeting exactly, more establishing a fact. "I know who you are?" She glanced up. "Elena Voss? I don't have a unit designation that's going to mean anything to you, so don't bother asking. How did you come through their line?" Carefully. One of the soldiers behind Hayes made a small sound. She didn't acknowledge it. "That's not an answer," Hayes said. "It's the only answer I have time for right now." She stood, unfolding from the crate with the slight stiffness of someone whose joints had been cold and compressed for too long. "I need your perimeter schematic, your current radio situation, and whatever intelligence you've developed on their positioning over the last 3 days. After that, I'll tell you what I found coming through." Hayes studied her for a moment. The way she stood, the way she held the question of his authority at a kind of respectful arm's length without quite deferring to it. He had met soldiers who were confident and soldiers who were arrogant, and they looked different. She didn't fit either category neatly. "You got a call sign?" he asked. Something shifted slightly at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile. "Overwatch," she said, "but most people just call me Voss." Hayes did not immediately show her the operations room. He was not a man who trusted easily, especially not during a siege, especially not when trust had a tactical cost. A woman who walked through enemy lines and presented herself at a forward operating base during an active encirclement could be exactly what she appeared to be, or she could be exactly what she appeared to be for purposes he hadn't yet identified. He'd been in the military long enough to know that the second option existed and had to be considered. He put her in a side room with Sergeant Marsh, while 2 soldiers confirmed what she'd told them about the Eastern approach. Her tracks in the mud, the path she'd taken, the specific gap in the enemy's picket line she'd moved through. It took 40 minutes. When it came back clean, when the track evidence confirmed a solo movement through terrain that should have made solo movement impossible, Hayes went and got her himself. "You want to walk me through how you actually did that?" he said, sitting across from her in the operations room. She had a cup of something hot. Someone had given her coffee, which she held with both hands as if the warmth itself was the point. She glanced at the map on the table between them. "They've got 8 primary positions on the outer ring," she said. 4 with heavy weapons, 4 infantry support. The eastern picket is their lightest because they don't expect any movement that way. Too much elevation change, too much mud exposure. They've got 2-man teams on 2-hour rotations. At the rotation changeover, there's a 4 to 6 minute window before the new team gets eyes properly on the ground. She looked up at him. "I came through during the window." 4 minutes, Hayes said. 5, last night. They were slow. Rain makes people slow. Marsh was standing against the wall behind Hayes. He made the small sound again. "That's about 300 meters of exposed ground," Hayes said. 280, she said. "I measured." He stared at her. "You measured." "I was going to have to come back through." She set the coffee down. Now, I came through their position, which means I spent time on their side of the wire before I crossed. I want to show you what I found. What she had found was, in operational terms, both very good news and very bad news, which was a combination Hayes had learned to recognize as the military's default mode of delivering information. The good news: the enemy force surrounding Crimson was not as large as initial assessments had estimated. The darkness and the rain and the general chaos of the first hours of the siege had created a threat picture that was inflated. The actual numbers were significant, but not overwhelming. The bad news: they were being commanded with unusual discipline by what appeared to be 3 separate command nodes operating in close coordination. That coordination was the reason the siege had been so effectively maintained. It was the reason every probe and every radio attempt had been anticipated and countered. Someone on the other side had planned this carefully, and 3 people were actively managing that plan in the field. Remove the command structure, Elena said, and the coordination collapses. These aren't highly motivated ideological fighters. They're professionals doing a job. When the direction disappears, the response time degrades, the flanks stop communicating, and the outer ring becomes porous enough for a convoy to push through. She had laid 3 positions on the map. 2 of them were in the valley below the ridge. One was further back, elevated, clearly the senior command post. Hayes looked at the positions. He looked at the map. He looked at the rifle. "You're talking about 3 shots," he said. 3 shots at range, at targets that won't know they're being engaged until it's already done. She said it without inflection, without drama. The way you discuss a technical problem that has a technical solution. The envelope is difficult, but it's not outside what I can do. "And where are you shooting from?" She pointed to the map. "A ridge position to the northeast, elevated, exposed on 3 sides. That's nearly a mile from the nearest support," Hayes said. "Yes." "If they identify your position, they will identify my position," she said. "After the second shot, at the latest. That's the nature of the work." Hayes sat back. He was aware of Marsh behind him, and of the particular quality of silence a room develops when everyone in it is thinking the same thing, but no one is ready to say it yet. "You're talking about being the target," Hayes said. "I'm talking about making sure the targets are the right people," she said. "What happens to me after is a secondary problem." "That's a significant thing to be casual about." "I'm not being casual." She looked at him with those gray or green eyes, and there was something in them that was not fear and not bravado and not the performed toughness Hayes had seen soldiers try to carry when they wanted to seem harder than they were. It was something quieter than all of that, something that had already been through a calculation he wasn't party to and arrived at a conclusion she wasn't going to explain. "I've done the math, it works." "The math on what exactly?" She didn't answer immediately. She picked up the coffee again, drank, set it down. "The math on whether the outcome is worth the risk," she said. "It is. So let's talk about what you need from your end to support this." Hayes didn't say yes immediately. He was not a man who said yes to anything immediately, and he especially didn't say yes to plans that required placing an asset, even a self-described, self-sufficient, unaffiliated asset, in a position with no support, no extraction, and no margin for error. That wasn't tactical decision-making. That was wishful thinking wearing a tactical hat. He sent Marsh out. He sat alone with Elena Voss in the operations room, and he asked her questions that had nothing to do with the plan and everything to do with whether the plan made sense coming from the person who was proposing it. He asked about her background. She answered obliquely, giving him fragments that didn't add up to a complete picture, but added up to something real. The kind of specificity that can't be improvised, references to places and operations and methods that only made sense if she'd actually been there. She knew the phonetic alphabet for 3 different communication systems. She used range estimation terminology correctly, without thinking about it. When he mentioned a particular type of long-range engagement protocol used by a certain specialized unit, she corrected his description of it without hesitation and without looking like she knew she was correcting him. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know who she worked for. But he was becoming increasingly certain she was what she appeared to be. A precision shooter with more field experience than anyone in his compound, presenting herself during a siege with a plan that was either brilliant or suicidal, and calmly arguing that the difference between those 2 descriptions was execution. "You've done this before," he said. "Made a plan?" "Walked into something like this and walked out again." She considered that. "I've walked in," she said. The out again part varies. What does that mean? It means I'm still here. He looked at her for a long moment. Why, he said. Why come through their line? Why come to us at all? You could have gone around. You could have gotten to a relay point and called in the situation and waited for the convoy. The convoy is 4 days out minimum, she said. You don't have 4 days. How do you know what we have? Because I've been on the ridge above you for 6 hours watching your supply runs between buildings, she said. You're rationing. Your medical setup on the north side is triage prepped, not treatment prepped, which means you're expecting mass casualties and you don't have the supplies to handle them. And your south-facing sentries are rotating every 90 minutes instead of 2 hours, which means you're running short on rested personnel. She paused. You've got maybe 50 hours before the situation inside the wire becomes as dangerous as the situation outside it. Hayes said nothing. So that's why, she said. He gave her the ammunition. Not because he had fully decided to trust her. Not because the plan didn't carry risks that made his chest feel tight when he looked at the map. But because the alternative was sitting inside a shrinking perimeter with 97 soldiers and a timeline that ended badly, and Elena Voss had walked through 280 meters of enemy-controlled ground in a 4-minute window because she'd measured the distance in advance. You couldn't dismiss that. Even Hayes couldn't dismiss that. He gave her the ammunition, and he gave her Marsh's radio frequency and a brevity code so she could communicate without broadcasting content. And he assigned 2 soldiers to create a diversionary noise event on the western side of the compound 30 minutes before her first shot to cover her approach to the ridge. She listened to all of it, nodded at what was useful, and said nothing about the rest. Before she left, she checked the rifle with a thoroughness that Hayes found hypnotic in a way he couldn't fully articulate. Not because it was fast or dramatic, but because it was absolutely methodical, each component verified in a sequence that was clearly the same sequence she always used, her hands moving with the specific confidence of a person who has done the same action thousands of times and has stopped having to think about it. She adjusted the scope. She checked the ammunition she'd been given. She looked at the sky through the operations room's small, high window and calculated something he couldn't follow. Dawn, she said. Dawn, Hayes confirmed. She picked up the rifle. She looked at him. Keep your people off the east wall during the engagement, she said. It's going to get loud on that side and I don't want anyone overreacting. What are you expecting? I'm expecting them to be angry, she said simply. That's the point. She left before he could think of a response. The night stretched out in the particular way nights stretch during a siege, slow and fast at the same time, crawling when you wanted it to move and moving when you needed it to slow down so you could think. Hayes walked the perimeter at midnight. He checked on the medical station. He read through the intelligence summaries again, even though he'd already read them so many times the language had started to lose meaning. At 0200, he went back to the operations room and stared at the map. Sergeant Marsh came in at 0230 with 2 cups of actual coffee, not the reconstituted powder they'd been running on for 2 days, but the last of the real beans from the supply cache, ground with the small hand grinder. Someone's partner had packed in a care package 6 weeks ago. He set 1 cup in front of Hayes without being asked. You think she can do it? Hayes said. Marsh sat down across from him. He was quiet for a moment, which was not unusual. Marsh operated on a different timeline than most people when it came to formulating responses. He thought first. He answered second. I think, Marsh said slowly, that I have never in 22 years seen anybody walk through active enemy positions with no support, no backup plan, and arrive on the other side looking like they just came in from a long walk. That's not an answer. No, Marsh agreed, but I don't think there is an answer right now. She'll either do it or she won't. He picked up his coffee. I think she'll do it. Hayes said nothing. She measured the distance, Marsh said. Sir, she measured the distance before she came through because she was already planning to come back through after. She didn't need us to tell her she could make it. She already knew. He paused. That's not bravado. That's preparation. Hayes stared at the map. Get some sleep, he said. We'll know in a few hours. Marsh stood. He got to the door and stopped. She asked me something, he said, before you pulled me out of the room earlier. What? She asked if any of the soldiers here were from the valley, local, if anyone here knew the terrain from before. Hayes turned. Why? She said she wanted a second opinion on the wind patterns on the North Ridge. Marsh frowned slightly. I told her Specialist Oren grew up about 40 kilometers from here. And? She spent 20 minutes talking to him about which way the wind turns when the rain stops. He paused. The rain is supposed to stop around 0400. Hayes looked at the window, rain still falling. She's already accounting for conditions that aren't here yet, Marsh said. He left. Hayes sat with that for a long time. At year 34D, someone on the radio, the secondary frequency, the one that wasn't jammed, clicked twice. It was the brevity code. It meant she was in position, 20 minutes ahead of schedule. Hayes told himself this was a good sign. He wasn't entirely certain. He went to the east wall, keeping back from it, below the parapet, and looked out across the dark valley where nothing was visible but rain and shapes, and the occasional distant movement of men who did not know what was positioned on the ridge above them. He thought about what she'd said. Not an army. Their confidence. At 0415, the diversion went off on the western side. Controlled noise, nothing that would draw fire, just enough movement and activity to pull attention. It lasted 3 minutes. Then it stopped. Then the valley went quiet, except for the rain. Hayes checked his watch. 420. 421, 422, 423. He was aware of his own heartbeat in a way he hadn't been for a long time. He was aware of Marsh 3 feet to his left, saying nothing. He was aware of 97 soldiers inside the wire who didn't know what was about to happen, who were sleeping or standing watch or sitting in the dark with their own calculations. 437. The rain was still falling, and somewhere on a ridge nearly a mile away, a woman who had measured 280 meters of enemy-controlled ground before she came through it, who had spent 20 minutes talking to a specialist about wind patterns in a valley she'd never stood in before, who had done a math problem Hayes wasn't fully party to and arrived at an answer she was willing to stake everything on. She settled behind the scope. She controlled her breathing. She found her first target. And then the valley changed. The rifle cracked. A single sound, sharp and flat, and immediately swallowed by the rain. And across the valley, the Western Communication Tower, where the enemy's primary coordination node had been operating for 3 days, went completely dark. No explosion, no dramatic collapse, just silence where there had been signal. For 2 full seconds, nobody inside Forward Base Crimson moved or spoke. Then Marsh said very quietly, "God." And Hayes knew it in the way you know some things before your mind has finished processing them, that the woman they'd been told was a myth had just proven she was something considerably more dangerous. The siege was not over. It was not anywhere close to over. But something had shifted in the valley, some weight in the air had changed, and Hayes was still standing there with his hands on the cold concrete of the parapet when his radio cracked twice, and then a third time. A third click that wasn't in the brevity code they'd agreed on. Hayes looked at Marsh. Marsh looked at Hayes. "That's not our signal," Marsh said. "No," Hayes said. The radio cracked again. 4 clicks this time. Then a burst of static. Then silence. And from somewhere out in the rain-dark valley, from a direction Hayes couldn't immediately identify, came the sound of engines. Not one engine. Several. Moving fast and moving toward them from the northeast and not slowing down. The engines were not slowing down. Hayes pressed himself against the parapet and listened, because in bad light and bad weather your ears were more reliable than your eyes. And what his ears were telling him was that there were multiple heavy vehicles moving fast on the northeast approach road, the same road the enemy had sealed 72 hours ago, the same road that had been confirmed impassable by 3 separate scout reports. The sound was wrong for enemy vehicles. The engine pitch was wrong. The interval between them was wrong. And they were moving with the particular organized aggression of a convoy that knew exactly where it was going and had decided to get there quickly. "Get me eyes on the northeast approach," Hayes said. Marsh was already moving. He had the radio to his mouth, talking in short, clipped bursts to the observation post on the north wall. And Hayes watched him process the response and saw the expression on his face shift into something that wasn't quite relief but was adjacent to it. "Friendlies," Marsh said. 4 vehicles. Military pattern. They're flying the right identifier." "How did they get through?" "North Road. Apparently there was a gap." "There was no gap. We had 3 reports." "There's a gap now, sir." Hayes stared at him. The radio cracked. a voice he didn't recognize, clipped and professional, running through a standard identification protocol with the kind of practice speed that meant the person on the other end had done it many times in conditions much worse than this. Hayes took the handset and ran the countersign sequence and confirmed the identity of the convoy. 4 armored vehicles, a 12-person rapid assessment team from a unit designation. Hayes recognized, but had never personally worked with, dispatched on a timeline that didn't match the relief convoy schedule by any logic Hayes could immediately construct. "Who sent you?" he asked. Static. Then, "We'll debrief on the ground, Commander. ETA 4 minutes. Keep your people off the northeast gate approach." The connection closed. Hayes looked at Marsh. Marsh looked at Hayes. Neither of them said anything immediately because there was nothing immediately useful to say, and both of them understood that the situation had just become more complicated in a direction neither had anticipated. 4 minutes later, the vehicles came through the northeast gate. The team leader was a woman named Major Dara Fenn, and she stepped out of the lead vehicle with the brisk economy of movement that Hayes associated with people who were perpetually behind schedule and had stopped apologizing for it. She was compact, sharp-featured, her hair pulled back so tightly it looked structural, and she had the kind of eyes that cataloged a room the moment she walked into it. Not aggressively, just efficiently, the way a good mechanic looks at an engine they've never seen before. She shook Hayes' hand once, firm, brief. "Commander, we need to get inside." "I have questions." "I have answers," she said. "Inside is better." He brought her to the operations room. 2 of her team came with her, a tall, angular man carrying a communications package that looked considerably more sophisticated than anything Hayes had on the base, and a younger soldier with a tablet and the particular expression of someone who has been awake for 20 hours and is running entirely on task focus. The rest of her team spread out through the compound with the practiced efficiency of people who had done exactly this, arrived at a compromised position and immediately begun assessing it, more times than they bothered to count. In the operations room, Fenn looked at Hayes' map for approximately 10 seconds. "Your assessment was right about the command nodes," she said. "We've been tracking this group for 11 days. 3 separate command elements operating a coordinated encirclement. Whoever planned this understood that a standard siege approach gives the defending force too many options, so they divided the command authority to prevent a single point of failure. Smart." "Someone on our end got there first," Hayes said. Fenn looked up from the map. "Explain." "About 6 hours ago, a woman came through the eastern perimeter. Civilian gear, no unit identifier. She'd been on the ridge above us, conducting her own assessment." Hayes paused. 20 minutes ago, she took her first shot. Western communication node." Fenn was very still for a moment. "The tower went dark." "Yes. We saw that from the northeast approach." She looked at him with an expression that had become considerably more careful. "What's her name?" "She gave me Voss. Elena Voss." The silence that followed was approximately 3 seconds long, which was not a long silence in absolute terms but was long enough to be significant in a room with people who communicated professionally in compressed language. "She's here," Fenn said. It wasn't a question. "She's on the ridge." "Which ridge?" Hayes pointed to the map. Fenn looked at the position. She looked at the distance from support. She looked at the terrain exposure. Her jaw tightened fractionally. "How long has she been in that position?" "She checked in at 0340. It's now..." Hayes glanced at his watch. 0449. "Over an hour." Fenn turned to the tall man with the communications package. "Kovacs, get me eyes on that ridge." "Already running it," Kovacs said, not looking up from his equipment. "Who is she?" Hayes asked. Fenn looked at him. She seemed to be making a decision about how much of the answer to give. "She's someone," Fenn said, "who shouldn't be here. She walked through their line. She identified 3 command nodes before we had any of that intelligence. She took a shot that neutralized the western node, and she is currently sitting on an exposed ridge nearly a mile from support, preparing to take 2 more. Hayes kept his voice level. "With respect, Major, someone who shouldn't be here is a thin description. It's the accurate one." Fenn moved to the window. The rain was thinning slightly, the sky beginning to separate from pure black into the first suggestion of very dark gray. "She operates outside established channels. Has for years. We know what she can do. We have less certainty about why she makes the choices she makes." She said she came because the convoy was 4 days out, and we didn't have 4 days. She'd know that. How? Because she's been watching you for longer than 6 hours. Ben turned back to face him. The ridge she's on, the one she claimed she went to for the engagement position. There's a hide site on the north face of that ridge that we know she's used before. The preparation time for a hide site like that is minimum 2 days. She let that land. She was watching you before the siege, possibly before the siege started. Hayes absorbed this. She knew it was coming, he said. She knew something was coming. Fenn's expression was complicated. She tends to know things like that. It's part of what makes her... She stopped, started again. It's part of who she is. You're not going to tell me what unit she's with. I'm not going to tell you that because I don't have a clean answer. Ben pulled out a chair and sat down at the map table. What I can tell you is that the work she does is real, the record is real, and if she has a plan for those remaining 2 nodes, you should probably let her execute it. She's been on that ridge for over an hour with no support. I know. If they've already identified... I know, Commander. Ben said it not impatiently, but with the particular firmness of someone who understood the concern and had already run its implications and arrived at a conclusion she wasn't going to pretend was comfortable. Kovacs, what have you got? What Kovacs had was a thermal feed from a drone that his team had pushed into the air over the valley during the convoy approach. Small, low noise, running dark. It showed the valley in the particular false color clarity of thermal imaging. Warm bodies against cold ground, vehicle heat signatures, the slowly cooling remnants of the western communication position. And on the northeast ridge, one small signature, stationary. Flat to the ground, which was why the thermal return was minimal. She was managing her heat signature the way you manage it when you know someone might be looking. But she was there, alive, in position. No movement on her position yet, Kovacs said. They haven't found her. Yet, said the young soldier with the tablet, whose name Hayes hadn't caught. Tell her, Fenn said, not looking up. Useful observations only. Teller said nothing further. Hayes watched the thermal feed and thought about the math Elena had described. She had said the enemy would identify her position after the second shot, at the latest. She had said it as though it were a fixed condition of the operation, a known variable that had already been factored in. She had not said it as though it frightened her. He had met soldiers who were not frightened of things that should frighten them, and that quality was not always a virtue. Sometimes it was a sign of something broken. Sometimes it was a sign of something so thoroughly processed that the fear had been converted into something else, into preparation, into the particular cold water clarity that comes when a person has been in enough bad situations to stop being surprised by them. He didn't know yet which one Elena was. He wasn't sure it mattered in the immediate term. What's the timeline on the second node? He asked. Fenn looked at the map. At current enemy disposition, they'll start their command conference at approximately 0500. That's when the artillery coordinator comes out of cover to do the pre-assault coordination with the infantry elements. It's a standing pattern. They've done it every morning of the siege. 12 to 15 minutes of exposure. She paused. She'll know that pattern. She's been watching longer than we have. So she's waiting, Hayes said. She's waiting. He looked at the thermal feed. The small signature on the ridge, flat and still and patient in the cold. Major, he said, what happened the last time you worked with her? Fenn looked at him. Something moved through her expression that she controlled quickly and completely. We didn't work with her, she said. She worked around us. There's a difference. At 0503, the valley changed. It didn't change dramatically. There was no obvious signal, no sudden burst of enemy activity. But the thermal feed showed a shift in the pattern of warm bodies in the valley below, a coalescence around one point that indicated people gathering for a purpose. The artillery coordinator's position. The morning conference beginning on schedule, the way it always had, the way the enemy had no reason to believe it wouldn't this morning. They didn't know the western node was gone because of a mechanical failure rather than an attack. That was what the single shot had looked like from their side, a sudden technical failure of the tower equipment, because nobody survives a shot at that range long enough to report being shot at. They didn't know someone was on the ridge. They didn't know that this morning was different from any other morning. Hayes was at the map table. Fenn was beside him. Kovacs was running the drone feed. Teller was watching something on the tablet and had gone very quiet. The radio was silent. 504, 505. There, Kovacs said quietly. The thermal feed showed the gathering complete. 8 or 9 figures around the artillery coordinator's position, close enough that the signatures overlapped. Hayes watched. He was aware of holding his breath and made himself stop. And then the rifle cracked. The sound coming to them across the valley a moment after the thermal signature showed the result, because that was the nature of distance. And the cluster of signatures on the feed erupted into chaos. Not all of them gone. Not that. But the center of the cluster had changed, and the remaining figures were scattering in the particular panicked geometry of people who have just understood that they are being shot at from a direction they cannot immediately identify. Mortar teams, Fenn said quietly. Watch the mortar teams. On the feed, the mortar positions went still. Not stood down. Still. The difference between a position that has received an order to hold and a position that has lost the coordinator who gives orders. The artillery coordinator was the communications link between the senior command and the mortar elements. Without that link, the mortars waited for instruction that wasn't coming. The assault timeline had just broken. Hayes let out a breath. 2, Marsh said from behind him. That's 2. She's still got one more, Teller said. He was looking at the tablet, and his voice had taken on a different quality, not the performative observation that Fenn had silenced earlier. Something actually careful. The senior node, that's the hard one. It's elevated, it's covered, and after what just happened, they're going to move it. She knows that, Hayes said. She'll have maybe 8 minutes before they fully displace, Teller said. That's if they react fast. These people react fast. She knows that too, Hayes said. He looked at the thermal feed, at the small signature on the ridge, at the stillness of it. He thought about what she'd said about the math. The 8 minutes passed the way. Minutes pass when you're watching a feed that shows you exactly enough to understand what's happening and not enough to do anything about it. The senior command node was moving, not fast enough. They were dealing with the confusion of losing the artillery coordinator, the sudden silence from the western tower, the scattered reports from the valley that weren't adding up into a coherent picture yet. The enemy commander was experienced, but he was also now receiving fragmented information from 3 directions and trying to construct a response while simultaneously relocating. That was the problem with losing command elements sequentially. Each loss degraded the quality of information flowing to the next level up. By the time the senior commander understood what was happening, he was already making decisions on incomplete data. He moved his position. But he didn't move it far enough. Because the thermal feed showed him clearly, and the ridge where Elena was positioned had line of sight to the new location, and she had been watching the valley long enough to know the terrain well enough to know that. She can see him, Kovacs said. It came out slightly hushed, not dramatically, just the way you say something when the thing you're saying hasn't fully processed yet. She can see him, Fenn confirmed. Hayes watched the feed. The senior commander was in cover, partial cover, the kind that would stop direct visual observation from the valley floor. Not the kind that stopped a shooter on an elevated ridge position who had spent 2 days building a complete picture of every hide, every covered route, every location in this valley that someone important might think was safe. He doesn't know the ridge has line of sight, Marsh said. No, Hayes said. She's going to have to take that shot through a very narrow window, Teller said. The coverage on his left side is Teller, Fenn said. I'm just saying the geometry is. She knows the geometry, Fenn said. There was something in her voice that was not impatience and not quite certainty either. Something in between. Stop helping her and start watching. The feed was still. The valley was very quiet. And then the enemy commander understood, in the way experienced soldiers sometimes understand things slightly before those things happen, that the ridge position to his northeast had line of sight to where he was standing. He started to move. He didn't finish. The third shot was different from the first 2. The sound of it reached the base a full second later, which meant the range was greater, which meant Elena had needed to account for conditions at a distance that pushed against the outer limits of reliable precision. The wind had changed when the rain thinned, exactly as Specialist Oren had told her it would, and she had spent 20 minutes talking to him about that specific transition. The feed showed the result. The senior command position went from organized to chaotic in approximately 4 seconds. And then something nobody in the operations room had been tracking because everybody had been watching the senior position, something on the thermal feed, something on the ridge itself. Her position, Kovacs said, and this time his voice was different. They're concentrating on her ridge. All available assets. How many? Hayes was already moving. All of them, sir. Kovacs was running the count on the feed. Every portable asset they have, they know where she is. The mathematics of the situation changed in that moment with the particular brutality of tactical math. 3 shots, 3 targets, mission accomplished. That was one calculation. One shooter exposed on a ridge with no support while the entire remaining enemy force turned its attention in her direction. That was another calculation entirely, and the answer it produced was not a good one. Can she move? Marsh asked. She should move, Fenn said. She should already be moving. On the feed, the signature on the ridge was not moving. It was flat. Still. In exactly the position it had been in. Hayes looked at the feed for a moment that felt longer than it was. She's not leaving, he said. She needs to leave, Fenn said. Tell her that. Fenn reached for the radio. Cha. The frequency Elena had been given was the secondary channel, the one that wasn't jammed. Fenn tried it, twice. The first time she got static. The second time she got 2 clicks. The brevity code, the one that meant in position, which under the current circumstances meant either that Elena had heard the transmission and was acknowledging from a prone firing position without being able to speak, or that she was running a preset response and could not respond at all. Voss, Fenn said. This is Fenn. You need to displace. You have a full asset concentration incoming on your position. Do you copy? 2 clicks. That means she hears you, Teller said. That means she's breathing, Fenn said. It doesn't mean she's leaving. Hayes was already pulling on his jacket. Marsh saw this and his expression did something complicated. Sir, get me 2 people, Hayes said. Northeast egress, fast. Commander. Fenn turned. You cannot go to that ridge. She can't come off it alone if they're concentrating. She chose that position. She understood the exposure. I gave her the ammunition, Hayes said. I gave her the assignment. She did the work. He looked at Fenn with the particular steadiness of a man who had already finished the argument in his own head. I'm not leaving her on that ridge because it got complicated. Fenn stared at him. 2 people, he said again to Marsh. Fast. Getting to the ridge took longer than Hayes wanted and shorter than he feared. The path Elena had described, the northeast drainage cut, the loose rock traverse, the final approach on the blind side of the ridgeline, was exactly as she'd described it, which meant she'd mapped it out before she'd even come to them, before she'd proposed the plan, before any of this had started. She had walked into his compound with every variable already calculated. That thought was still with him when he came over the ridge crest and found her. She was behind the sandbag position she'd built herself, and she was not, as he had briefly allowed himself to hope, simply waiting for the situation to resolve. The enemy had begun targeting the ridge. The first impacts had landed short, 50 meters down the slope, but they were walking them in with the systematic patience of people who had a direction and unlimited motivation. Dirt was still falling from the nearest impact when Hayes reached her. She was flat against the sandbags, rifle up, and she was bleeding. Not badly. Not yet. A fragment from one of the early impacts had caught her left forearm, tearing a 4-inch gash through the outer layer of her sleeve and the skin beneath it. She had wrapped it with a piece of her own gear, tightly, one-handed, with the automatic efficiency of someone who had done field dressing one-handed before, and she had gone back to the rifle. I told you, she said, not looking up, to keep your people off the east wall. East wall, Hayes said, dropping down beside her. We're on a ridge. Smart man. Another impact, this one 30 meters. Closer. The 2 soldiers Hayes had brought went flat without being told. You need to leave this position, Hayes said. Not yet. Boss, there's a secondary radio position they set up when the first node went down, she said, still not looking at him, her eye behind the scope. 90 meters east of where the first tower was. They've been using it for the last 20 minutes to re-coordinate. If they finish that coordination, the mortar teams get new orders and we lose the window we just created. Hayes looked where she was indicating. He couldn't see what she was seeing. He didn't have the scope. You've already done what you came to do, he said. Not completely. The 3 targets were not enough. She exhaled slowly. The command is gone. The coordination link is not gone. Those are 2 different things. She adjusted something on the scope. This takes 2 more minutes, then we can leave. Hayes looked at his two soldiers. They were watching the slope below with the very focused attention of people who had registered that there were things moving down there. 2 minutes, Hayes said. Maybe 3. Voss? 90 seconds then. She steadied. Stop talking. He stopped talking. The ridge shook with another impact, this one close enough that Hayes felt the pressure change in his ears. Dirt and small rocks rained down across the sandbags. The two soldiers pressed flat. Hayes kept his eyes on the slope and his hand near the radio. And Elena Voss held completely still, bleeding quietly into the field dressing on her arm, eye behind the scope, breathing controlled, and found the secondary radio position in the middle of an active artillery adjustment on her location. One breath. The rifle cracked. Below in the valley, the secondary communications position went silent. And in the sudden absence of fire direction, the mortar teams waited once more for orders that were no longer coming. The valley did not go quiet. There was still plenty of movement, still plenty of activity, still the organized anger of a large force that had just lost its third command element in under an hour. But the specific silence of fire coordination was there. The orders that would have organized the final assault into something coherent had no pathway to reach the people waiting to receive them. Elena lowered the rifle. She looked at Hayes. Okay, she said. Now we can leave. Her face was pale under the dirt and the cold, and the field dressing on her arm was dark and needed proper attention, and she was already reaching for the rifle drag bag with the hand that wasn't compromised, moving with the deliberate economy of someone who has used up a significant amount of their reserves and is now running on what's left. Hayes took the rifle from her. She looked at him. I can carry it, she said. I know you can, he said. He didn't give it back. She held his gaze for a moment, and something moved through her expression that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite gratitude. Something more complicated than either of those things. Something that came and went too quickly for him to fully read. Then she nodded once, and they moved off the ridge together in the early gray light, with the valley below them disorganized and leaderless, and the pale edge of dawn beginning to show along the eastern hills. The siege was not yet broken, but the mechanism that had held it in place was gone, and the enemy below knew it, and the knowledge of it was moving through their ranks in the particular way bad news moves, fast and distorting and without mercy. Hayes's radio cracked. Fenn's voice tight and controlled. Commander, we have movement on the southern approach. Not enemy. Repeat, not enemy. You need to get back here now. Hayes looked at Elena. She had heard it. Movement, she said. Not a question. You know what it is? He asked. She was quiet for half a second. Her jaw tightened. There's someone else in this valley, she said. Someone who shouldn't be here. She looked at him, and the thing in her eyes this time was not the cold precision of someone working through a technical problem. It was something older than that, something that had a weight to it she'd been carrying for a while. And they're not here for the siege. Hayes stared at her. They're here for me, she said. They were here for her. Hayes processed that in the 4 seconds it took to clear the last section of ridge traverse. And he processed it the way you process information that doesn't immediately fit the framework you've been operating in, by setting it aside long enough to get to somewhere stable, then pulling it back out and looking at it properly. Elena moved beside him with the controlled economy of someone managing pain without advertising it. The arm was worse than she'd let on the ridge. He could tell by the way she held it slightly away from her body, not dramatically, just enough that the fabric didn't press against the wound. She hadn't complained once. She hadn't mentioned it again. They came down the northeast drainage, cut and through the gate and into the compound, and Major Fenn was waiting for them in the yard with an expression Hayes had not seen on her face before. Fenn looked at Elena. Elena looked at Fenn. Something passed between them in that look, something with history in it, something that had been carried for a while and hadn't gotten lighter with time. Not hostility exactly. More like two people who had covered a significant amount of difficult ground in relation to each other and hadn't finished the conversation that ground had started. You're bleeding, Fenn said. Fragment, Elena said. It's managed. It needs proper attention. After. Elena looked at Hayes. What came through the south? Hayes looked at Fenn. Fenn looked at the ground briefly, then back up. 2 vehicles, Fenn said. They came through the southern breach point that opened up when the mortar coordination broke down. They're inside the wire. They identified themselves on our frequency using correct protocols. She paused. Defense intelligence, specifically the Vantage section. The name landed in the yard between the three of them and did something to the air. Hayes didn't know what Vantage section was. He could see from Elena's face that she did. She didn't move. She didn't change her expression in any dramatic way. But something went very still in her. The kind of stillness that isn't stillness at all, that is actually the opposite of stillness. A high-tension wire that looks motionless because every force pulling on it is perfectly opposed. How many personnel? Elena asked. 4 in the vehicles, 1 more already inside. Already inside, Elena repeated. He walked through the southern perimeter before the vehicles came. He identified himself as a coordinating officer. My people let him in because his credentials were clean. Fenn's voice was carefully flat. His name is Aldrich Soames. He says he's here on a standing extraction order. Extraction, Hayes said. Not for us, Fenn said. She was looking at Elena. For her. The operations room felt smaller than it had an hour ago. Hayes had cleared it down to essential personnel. Himself, Marsh, Fenn, Kovacs, and Elena, who had allowed someone to put a proper field dressing on her arm only after it became clear that nobody was going to have a functional conversation until she stopped dripping on the floor. She sat on the edge of the map table while a medic worked on the wound, and she held her arm still with the particular patience of someone who has been through medical attention in difficult circumstances enough times that the discomfort of it has become simply another thing to manage rather than something to react to. She hadn't asked about Soames again. She didn't need to. The way she'd gone quiet when Fenn said his name told Hayes everything he needed to know about the kind of quiet it was. The door opened. The man who came through it was approximately 50 years old, with the kind of physical presentation that suggested he'd been fit once, and had since traded that for a different kind of authority. He was clean for the field. His gear was right but unworn, which meant he hadn't come through difficult terrain to get here. His face had the careful neutrality of a person who has spent considerable time in rooms where expressions had tactical value and had learned to offer nothing for free. He looked at the room. He looked at Elena. He didn't look surprised to see her. Voss, he said. Soames, she said. The entire room managed to hear the 10 years of complicated history compressed into those 2 syllables. Soames moved to the table. He set a physical document down on the map. Actual paper, which was itself a statement about the nature of the authorization it carried. Hayes looked at it. The header was a classification designation he recognized. The content was an order, specific and dated and signed, and the name on the extraction order was Elena Voss. You've been out of contact for 11 days, Soames said. He said it the way you say something that is technically an observation, but is functionally an accusation. I've been in position, Elena said. You were ordered to stand down from this operation. I received a recommendation, she said. There's a difference. The order was explicit, Voss. The order, she said, was received through a relay channel that went dark 8 days ago. I had no confirmation it was genuine. She said it evenly, not defensively, just stating a sequence of events as they had occurred. Given the communication situation in this valley, which you would know about if you'd been tracking the operational environment instead of tracking me, the appropriate professional judgment was to continue the mission. Soames looked at her for a moment. The appropriate professional judgment, he repeated. Yes. 3 enemy command elements are dead. Yes. The siege on this position has effectively broken. That's ongoing, she said, but yes, the trajectory is there. And you're sitting in an operations room with a torn-up arm and no official standing, having executed a precision engagement operation on foreign soil without authorization. Elena didn't answer immediately. She looked at the document on the table. She looked at Soames. The 97 people in this compound are alive, she said. What's the question? Soames picked up the document. The question is whether you come with me now or whether this becomes considerably more formal. The room was very quiet. Hayes had been watching this exchange with the particular attention he gave to situations where he understood the surface and suspected the depth was considerably greater. He understood enough. He understood that the woman who had walked through enemy lines and taken 4 shots that changed the geometry of a siege was now being told that the shots had been unauthorized and that the authorization question was apparently more important to someone than the outcome. He put his hand on the document before Soames could pick it up fully. Soames looked at the hand, looked at Hayes. "Commander," Soames said, "this isn't your operational concern." "She's inside my wire," Hayes said. "Everything inside my wire is my operational concern. With respect, she needs medical attention." Hayes kept his hand on the document. "She's going to get it. After that, you can have whatever conversation you need to have, but not in the next 30 minutes. Soames studied him. The calculation was visible. Not quite, but close enough. 30 minutes, Soames said. 30 minutes, Hayes confirmed. Soames stepped back. He didn't leave the room. He moved to the wall, which was a statement about his intention to remain present rather than grant anything like privacy. And he stood there with the careful stillness of a man who was used to waiting and had decided this particular waiting was worth it. Hayes looked at Elena. She looked back at him with an expression that was not gratitude exactly, but was the closest thing to it that seemed to fit her face naturally. In the medical station, which was a partitioned section of the main bunker that smelled strongly of antiseptic and less strongly of the coffee that someone had spilled on the floor 2 days ago and hadn't fully cleaned up, the medic finished work on Elena's arm with the thorough unhurry of someone who was done being rushed. Elena sat on the examination table and didn't move while it happened. She was looking at the wall. Hayes stood nearby. He hadn't planned to stay, but he hadn't left either, and neither of them had commented on that. "Soames," Hayes said after a while. "How long?" "Long enough," Elena said. "That's not—" 7 years, she said. "He ran the program I worked under. Past tense. The program was restructured." She paused. "That's a polite word for what happened to it." "What actually happened to it?" She considered the wall for a moment. "Something went wrong on an operation," she said. "A significant something. The program got reviewed, the review found things it didn't like, and the people who had made decisions got moved around in ways that were designed to spread the accountability thin enough that nobody had to actually answer for anything." She said it without heat, just the flat recitation of something she'd had years to process. "Some of us were reassigned. Some of us were encouraged to find different employment. And you?" "I found different employment," she said, "on my own terms." "Which is why he has an extraction order." "Which is why he has an extraction order," she confirmed. "Because when you leave a program on your own terms instead of their terms, the program keeps a standing authorization to bring you back in whenever it seems useful." She looked at the medic. "Does this need stitches, or is tape going to hold it?" "Stitches would be better," the medic said. "Tape," she said. The medic taped it. Hayes watched the economy of the exchange. The medic not arguing, Elena not explaining, both of them operating in the compressed language of people who understand that some discussions have already been resolved before they start. "The operation that went wrong," Hayes said. She looked at him. "You don't have to tell me," he said. "But you brought it up." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the wall. "I took a shot," she said. "Long range, high confidence target. The intelligence said he was an active coordinator for a cell that had killed 14 people in the previous 6 weeks. She paused. "The intelligence was wrong. Not completely wrong. He was involved. But he was not the principal. He was a peripheral contact who happened to be at the same location." Another pause. "There was a second man at the location that we hadn't identified, the principal. He was there because of a meeting that nobody had flagged." She stopped. Hayes waited. "I took the wrong shot," she said. The principal walked away. 3 months later, he coordinated an attack that killed 22 people. She said it with the flatness of something repeated so many times internally that the words had worn smooth. "I have thought about the math on that every day since." The medical station was quiet except for the distant sounds of the compound, radio traffic, movement, the ongoing organized activity of a position that was still technically under siege even if the siege had lost its coherence. "That's why you came here," Hayes said. "Not just because the convoy was 4 days out." She didn't answer for a moment. "The 97, she said finally. "Every one of them that walks out of here it doesn't fix it. Nothing fixes it. But the math runs in a direction I can live with." She looked at him. "Does that make sense?" "More than you'd think," he said. Soames was back in the operations room when Hayes returned, and he had brought one of his vehicle personnel with him, a younger operative with the kind of unremarkable appearance that was itself a professional characteristic, the sort of face that didn't give the eye anything to catch on. He was standing near Kovac's equipment station, not touching anything, just being present in a way that was designed to establish a position. Kovacs had noticed. Kovacs was pretending he hadn't noticed. Ben was at the map, and she looked up when Hayes came in, and the look she gave him asked a question that he answered with a small shake of his head, which she received and interpreted correctly. 30 minutes is up, Soames said. Approximately, Hayes said. She needs to come with me. On whose authority? Soames set a second document on the map table. This one had more signatures on it, and a chain of authorization that climbed several levels higher than the first. Hayes looked at it. This is a military installation, Hayes said, currently in an active siege scenario, which gives me considerably broader authority over personnel and access than I would have under normal operational conditions. He looked up from the document. She came here as an asset supporting the defense of this position. I am not releasing that asset until the position is secure. Soames stared at him. That's a creative interpretation. I'm a creative man. Commander. Soames's voice shifted slightly. Not louder. More pointed. You're putting yourself in a difficult position for someone you met 8 hours ago. I've been in difficult positions for less reason. Hayes moved to the map. Here's where we are. The enemy has lost its command structure, its fire coordination is broken, and the remaining forces are going to either consolidate and try to rebuild, or they're going to begin withdrawing. My assessment, based on the behavior patterns we've seen over the past 72 hours, is that they won't consolidate. Their discipline was dependent on the command structure. Without it, these are professional fighters who have lost the thing that makes professional fighters want to stay in a bad position. He looked at Soames. When this position is confirmed secure, we can have the conversation you want to have, Hayes said. Until then, she stays. The order stays on the table. And you stay in this room. Soames's unremarkable operative by the equipment station shifted his weight slightly. Marsh, who had been standing so quietly near the door that Hayes had nearly forgotten he was there, moved to a position approximately 3 feet from the operative without appearing to have moved toward him at all. It was the kind of repositioning that only meant one thing, and the operative understood what it meant, and the two of them stood in their new positions without either one making eye contact. You're making this harder than it needs to be, Soames said. Probably, Hayes agreed. How's the view from where you're standing? Polch. The siege broke at 0831. Not with a dramatic announcement, not with any signal that Hayes could identify after the fact as the definitive moment of resolution. It broke the way complex things usually break, gradually, and then faster, the damage accumulating below the visible surface until the whole structure was already gone before anyone watching could see it. The thermal feed showed the withdrawal beginning on the northern flank first, small clusters of signatures moving away from the perimeter toward the tree line. Then the eastern flank followed, and then the western, and within 40 minutes what had been a disciplined encirclement was a dispersal, fighters moving toward the roads and the hills, in the small group patterns of people who had stopped receiving orders and were now operating on individual judgment about what came next. Individual judgment, when the mission was over and the command was gone and the weather was cold, tended toward survival. By 0900, the perimeter was clear. By 0920, Fenn's drone had confirmed that the heavy weapon positions had been abandoned, not destroyed, just left. Equipment that was too difficult to carry walking out of a valley on foot when the mission no longer existed. Hayes walked the perimeter himself at 0930. He needed to see it with his own eyes rather than through a feed, needed to feel the specific quality of a position that had been held and was now secure, the particular way the air changes when the immediate pressure is gone. 97 soldiers in a compound that 24 hours ago had been counting its remaining hours, and now the count had stopped and the math had changed. He found Elena on the north wall. She was looking out over the valley, which was still gray and cold, but no longer felt hostile in the same specific way. The rain had stopped completely at some point in the last hour, and the sky was doing the thing it does after rain, that slow brightening that isn't dramatic but is undeniable. She had the rifle in the drag bag across her back again. "It's over," he said. "The siege," she said. "Yes." She didn't say anything else immediately. She was looking at the valley with an expression that wasn't satisfaction and wasn't relief and wasn't any of the things Hayes might have expected to see on the face of a person who had just accomplished what she'd accomplished. It was something quieter, something that had been there before this and would be there after. Soames is going to push, she said. I know. You can't stop him indefinitely. The authorization is real. He has standing to act on it. I know that too. Looked at him. So why are you bothering? Hayes considered the question honestly, the way it deserved to be considered. Because the people who should be having the conversation about what you did here are not Soames and a document, he said. And because what happened in this valley in the last 12 hours deserves a different kind of accounting than whatever he has in mind. She held his gaze. That's an optimistic view of how institutions work, she said. I'm aware. Most of the time, Soames wins. Most of the time, Hayes said. This isn't most of the time. She looked at him for another moment. Then she turned back to the valley. There's something you should know, she said, about Soames, about why he has a standing extraction order, and why he pushed it all the way into an active siege to execute it. Hayes waited. He knows what the operation was, she said, the one that went wrong. He knows because he ran it. He built the intelligence package. He selected the target. She paused. The intelligence was wrong because he assembled it wrong. That's not speculation. That's what the internal review found, and then buried. Hayes was very still. The standing extraction order isn't about program security, she said. It's about keeping me close enough to manage what I know and far enough from anyone else that the managing is easy. She said it without drama, just the facts of it, stated plainly. I've known that for 4 years. It's why I left on my own terms. It's why he's been carrying that order ever since. And if you'd taken the official reassignment, I would have been somewhere quiet and contained, she said, and the review findings would have stayed buried, and the 22 people who died 3 months after I took the wrong shot would still be an operational footnote in a file that nobody reads. Hayes looked at the valley. He thought about Soames in the operations room, standing at the wall with his documents and his careful neutral expression and his standing extraction order. He thought about the math Elena described, the math that ran in a direction she could live with. He thought about 22 people. What do you need? He said. She looked at him. I need 30 minutes and access to Kovach's communications equipment, she said. The high-band relay. Not the jammed channels. The military backbone relay that your team brought in. She paused. There are people who need to receive a file. People who are not inside this valley and not inside Soames's organizational footprint. People who will know what to do with what's in it. You have the file. I've had it for 4 years, she said. I've been waiting for a moment when sending it didn't also mean ending it. She looked at the valley. Soames came into an active siege to get to me. That tells me the moment is now, whether I was ready for it or not. Hayes thought about what he was being asked to authorize. He thought about the documents on his map table and the chain of authority they represented. He thought about 23 years in uniform and what those years had taught him about the difference between following orders and following the thing that the orders were supposed to be in service of. He thought about a woman who had measured 280 meters of enemy-controlled ground because she was already planning to come back through. Kovacs, he said into his radio. Sir, I need you to do something for me. Soames knew. He knew the moment Hayes came back into the operations room with the particular deliberate calm of a man who has made a decision and has stopped second-guessing it. He knew because he had spent 22 years reading rooms and reading people, and the specific quality of Hayes's entry was legible to anyone who understood the language. He straightened from the wall. Commander, she needs 30 minutes on the high-band relay, Hayes said. Medical grounds. She's reporting her status to her coordinating authority. He moved to the map table and stood behind it in the particular way that a man stands behind a table when the table is the line. You're welcome to observe the communication. I'm not going to observe it, Soames said. I'm going to stop it. On what grounds? On the grounds that she has no coordinating authority. She operates outside established channels. Then there's nothing sensitive about the communication, Hayes said, because unofficial communications between unofficial parties carry no classification burden. He held Soames's gaze. So there's no grounds for interference, correct? The operative by the equipment station was paying close attention now. Marsh was still in the position he'd taken earlier. The geometry of the room had become very clear. and everyone in it understood the geometry. Soames looked at Hayes for a long time. "You understand what you're doing," Soames said. "I understand that I'm commanding this position," Hayes said, "and that for the next 28 minutes, this position operates according to my judgment." Soames looked at the map. He looked at the documents. He looked at Hayes. Then he looked at the door, and the calculation that moved through his expression was not about the documents anymore. It was about something else, something that Hayes recognized as a man assessing a situation and arriving at the conclusion that the situation had changed in a way that made the original plan no longer viable. "This isn't going to go the way you think," Soames said. "It already has," Hayes said. 3 rooms over, connected by Kovacs's relay equipment, running on the military backbone frequency that the enemy's jamming had never reached, Elena Voss was sending a file that had been sitting encrypted on a drive she carried in a waterproof case inside her drag bag for 4 years, sending it to people who had been waiting for exactly this moment. And the file contained things that Aldrich Soames had spent 4 years making sure stayed buried. Hayes didn't know the specific contents. He knew enough. He stood at his map table and he watched Soames and he counted the minutes. And at 27 minutes, the radio on Kovacs's equipment station cracked with a confirmation signal that meant the transmission had been received. And in the silence that followed that signal, the room had a different quality than it had before. Soames heard it. He closed his eyes for approximately 2 seconds. Then he opened them, and he looked at the operative by the wall, and something passed between them in that look, and the operative moved. Not toward Hayes, not toward the door, toward the communications equipment, with the particular focused movement of someone who has received a specific instruction and is executing it without deliberation. Marsh moved at exactly the same moment. The two of them covered the distance between their respective positions and arrived at the equipment station simultaneously, and what followed was not a fight in any dramatic sense. It was a brief, controlled, extremely professional physical disagreement between two people who were both very good at physical disagreements, that lasted approximately 4 seconds and ended with the operative against the wall and Marsh standing at the equipment station with an expression of mild professional satisfaction. The equipment was undamaged. The transmission had already completed. Soames looked at Hayes. Hayes looked at Soames. 22 people, Hayes said quietly. "That's where I'd start the conversation, if I were you." Soames said nothing. Outside the operations room, through the thick walls of the compound bunker, the Keldivar Valley was quiet and brightening, and the siege was over. And somewhere in that quiet, the weight of what had just moved through a high-band relay was making its way to people who would know what to do with it, and nothing about the next few months was going to be simple or clean or easy. But the math had shifted, and the direction it ran in now was different from the direction it had been running for 4 years. Hayes thought about Elena on the north wall, looking at the valley. He thought about what she'd said. "Every one of them that walks out of here it doesn't fix it, but the math runs in a direction I can live with." He thought about 22 people and about 97, and about the particular arithmetic of choices made in valleys far from anywhere clean, and he thought that the math was complicated and imperfect and always would be, but that some numbers mattered more than others, and some people understood that in their bones, and those people were worth standing behind a table for. He picked up his radio. "Marsh," he said. "Sir?" "Get me a medical update on Voss." A pause. "She's not in the medical station, sir." Hayes looked at the door. "Where is she?" Another pause. "East perimeter, sir." A beat. "She's already outside the wire." Hayes crossed to the window. The east wall was 200 meters away, and the gate was closed, and beyond the gate was the drainage cut and the ridge and the valley, and in all of that there was nothing moving that he could see. She was gone. She had done what she came to do, and she had done the thing she'd been waiting 4 years to do, and she had left before anyone could start a different kind of conversation about what came next. He stood at the window for a moment. Then Teller, from the corner of the room, said something that pulled Hayes back to the immediate situation with the bluntness of something genuinely unexpected. "Sir," Teller said. His voice was careful, too careful. "You need to see this." He was looking at the tablet, the drone feed. "The South Road," Teller said. "There are vehicles, a lot of vehicles. Military pattern, but they're not from any unit I have in the identification database, and they're moving toward us, and they're not slowing down, and..." He looked up from the tablet. And they have Voss, he said. Sir, they have her. She's in the second vehicle. Hayes was moving before Teller finished the sentence. Not running. The compound was still technically an active environment, and running created a specific kind of alarm that spread faster than information and was harder to correct. But moving with the compressed urgency of a man who has converted a decision into motion without stopping to narrate it. He hit the operations room door and went through it and crossed the yard toward the south wall in the particular way that made everyone he passed step out of the path without being told to. Marsh was a half step behind him. Fenn came through the door 30 seconds later, which meant she'd taken the time to grab her radio and her sidearm, which meant she'd assessed the situation faster than most people would have, and had immediately understood it was the kind of situation that warranted a sidearm. The South Wall observation post had a line of sight down the approach road for approximately 800 meters before it bent around a rock formation and disappeared. Hayes got to the position and took the binoculars from the soldier manning the scope without explanation and put them on the road. 6 vehicles, not 4. Teller had seen the feed at an angle and undercounted. 6 vehicles in a column formation, military pattern, but not standard military configuration. The spacing was wrong. The vehicle types were mixed in a way that suggested a unit that acquired its equipment from multiple sources over time, rather than drawing from a single supply chain. They were moving at convoy speed, not assault speed, which meant they weren't planning to come through the gate hot. They were planning to stop. In the second vehicle, through the windshield glass, Hayes could see a figure in the passenger seat. He adjusted the binoculars. Elena Voss. Upright. Not restrained visibly. Looking forward. Alive. She got outside the wire, and they were already there, Marsh said. I was looking through his own optic. They were waiting for her. They knew she was here, Hayes said. Soames. Or someone above Soames. Hayes lowered the binoculars. He looked at Fenn, who had arrived and was looking at the vehicles with an expression that had gone very controlled in a way that controlled expressions go when the person wearing them is processing something that has significant implications for their own situation. Major, what are those vehicles? Fenn took the binoculars. She looked for approximately 4 seconds. Vantage section transport, she said. Not Soames's team. Different element. She lowered the binoculars and looked at Hayes and said the next thing carefully. There are 2 vantage elements. The field arm, which Soames runs, and the oversight arm, which reviews the field arm's operations. She paused. I didn't know the oversight arm was in this region. But they are, Hayes said. They are. She looked at the vehicles, which means someone above Soames decided this situation required a different kind of attention than Soames provides. Is that good or bad? Fenn thought about it honestly. I don't know, she said. Oversight can mean accountability. It can also mean a more efficient version of the same thing. The lead vehicle stopped 200 meters from the south gate. A door opened. A man got out. He stood beside the vehicle and looked at the gate and then looked at the wall. And even at 200 meters, Hayes could see that he was not in any hurry, and that not being in a hurry was a conscious choice rather than an absence of urgency. He raised one hand, open palm, the universal gesture for a conversation rather than a confrontation. Hayes stared at him. Get me Soames, he said to Marsh. Soames came to the south wall with the particular gait of a man who already knows something bad has happened and is working out how bad as he walks. He looked at the vehicles. He looked at the man standing beside the lead vehicle. His jaw moved slightly in a way that wasn't speech. Who is that? Hayes asked. Soames didn't answer immediately. Soames. His name is Callum Reeve, Soames said. The name came out flat and without inflection, the way you say a name that carries a great deal of weight when you've decided you're not going to let the weight show. He runs Vantage's internal review function. Your oversight, technically. Is there a non-technical version? Soames looked at Hayes with the expression of a man who is reassessing how much of a problem the person he's looking at is going to be. He reviews operations. He investigates discrepancies. He makes recommendations about personnel and procedure to the section leadership. He paused. He's been investigating the Vantage program for approximately 8 months. Investigating what specifically? Another pause. Longer. Discrepancies, Soames said again. Hayes looked at the man standing beside the lead vehicle. He thought about what Elena had told him in the medical station. He thought about a file that had been sitting encrypted for 4 years and had been transmitted 40 minutes ago to people outside Soames's organizational footprint. He thought about the timing of Callum Reeves' arrival. She knew he was coming, Hayes said. Not to Soames. More to the air. What? Marsh said. The file. Hayes looked at Fenn. She didn't just send it to people who would know what to do with it. She sent it to people who were already in motion. Reeves' team was already on their way. The file was the signal. He worked through it. She's been coordinating with his investigation. That's why she had the file ready. That's why 4 years, not 3, not 2. 4 years. Waiting for the moment when Reeves' investigation was far enough along that the file would land on prepared ground instead of into a vacuum. Fenn was looking at him with an expression that suggested she was arriving at the same place from a slightly different direction. She didn't just come here for the siege, Fenn said. No, Hayes said. She came here because Reeves' team was already in this region, already moving, and Soames coming into an active siege to execute an extraction order meant that Soames knew Reeve was closing in and panicked. He looked at Soames. You came here to get her out before Reeve could get to her, before she could give him what she had. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that confirms things without anyone having to say them. Soames looked at the vehicles. He looked at Reeve standing patient and unhurried beside the lead transport. He looked at the wall and the gate and the 200 meters of road between his current position and whatever came next. I want a lawyer, Soames said. Hayes stared at him for a moment. We're in a forward base in an active conflict zone, Hayes said. I'm aware of where we are. There are no lawyers here. Then I want to speak to my chain of command. You can do that, Hayes said, after I open that gate. He looked at Marsh. Open the south gate, he said, and somebody go get her out of that vehicle. Callum Reeve was shorter than he'd appeared at 200 meters, and older, somewhere in his mid-60s, with white hair cut military short, and a face that had the particular deeply lined quality of a person who has spent considerable time outdoors in difficult conditions. He moved like someone for whom physical discomfort was a known quantity rather than an obstacle, and he came through the south gate and into the compound and looked at everything around him with the systematic attention of a man cataloging a scene. He looked at Hayes. Commander Hayes, he said, thank you for opening the gate. I'm going to want to understand the full situation before I decide whether the thanks are appropriate, Hayes said. Something shifted briefly at the corner of Reeves' mouth. Not quite a smile, more a recognition. Fair enough, he said. Elena came through the gate behind him, on her own feet, no escort. She looked at Hayes with an expression that had something new in it. Not quite apology, not quite explanation, something in between. The arm was still taped. She was still carrying the rifle. You knew he was coming, Hayes said. I knew he was in the region, she said. I didn't know the timeline until this morning. The transmission triggered his final approach. She paused. I didn't plan to be picked up outside the wire. That part was unscheduled. They just happened to be on the road you were walking. The south road was the most direct route to their staging position, she said. I chose the south road because I was in a hurry. It was a coincidence that turned into a convenience. Were you going to tell me? She held his gaze. I didn't know how much to tell you, she said. Some of it put you in a position. I was trying to limit what you were exposed to. By sending the file from my communications equipment. That part I should have explained better, she said. Yes, he said. You should have. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Reeve had moved on, taking in the compound with his systematic attention, and his team had spread out in a way that looked casual and was not casual, that had the organized coverage of people who had done site assessment in difficult environments before and had a method for it. Soames, Elena said. He's in the operations room, Hayes said. He asked for a lawyer. Something moved through her face. It wasn't satisfaction. It was more complicated than satisfaction. The expression of a person who has been anticipating a specific moment for long enough that when it arrives, it doesn't feel like victory so much as the end of something that was very heavy and has been set down. Reeve will want to speak to him, she said. Reeve can have him, Hayes said, after we talk. The debrief happened in the medical station, because it was the only room in the compound that wasn't occupied by one of 3 competing groups of personnel, all trying to manage a situation that had more layers than any of them had fully mapped. Reeve sat across from Hayes. Elena sat to Hayes's left. Fenn sat at the wall and didn't say much and missed nothing. Marsh stood at the door, which was closed. Reeve set a recorder on the table between them, looked at Hayes and said, "With your permission." "Go ahead," Hayes said. "Commander Hayes, what I'm going to tell you has a classification level that is, in normal circumstances, significantly above your current access." Reeve folded his hands on the table. "I'm choosing to brief you fully because you are the commanding officer of this position, because the actions taken in this compound in the last several hours are going to require a formal accounting, and because the accounting will be considerably less messy if you understand the complete context." He paused. "And because Voss told me you deserve it." Hayes glanced at Elena. She was looking at the table. "Start wherever makes sense," Hayes said. Reeve started with the program. The Vantage Field section had been established 11 years ago as a precision operation capability operating outside conventional military structure. Small teams, specific targets, outcomes that could be denied at multiple levels. Elena had been recruited into it 8 years ago from a special operations unit that Hayes recognized. She had, as she'd implied, a background that made her selection for Vantage straightforward. She was good at the work, and she was, by Reeve's characterization, honest about it in a way that the program's leadership found intermittently inconvenient. Aldrich Soames ran the field arm for 6 of those years, Reeve said. He was effective in the operational sense. He was also, as the internal review has established, in the practice of building intelligence packages that supported conclusions he had already reached for reasons that were not always purely operational. He decided what he wanted to find and then found it, Hayes said. Accurately put. Reeve didn't flinch at the bluntness. The operation that Voss was involved in, the one that produced the wrong outcome, was built on a package that Soames had manipulated, not fabricated entirely. Manipulated. He had elevated a peripheral contact to primary target status, because eliminating the primary target would have been significantly more complicated and would have required an additional 6 weeks of preparation that he didn't want to spend. He took the easier shot and gave her the coordinates, Hayes said. Yes. And 22 people died because the actual primary target walked away. Yes. The room was very quiet. Elena was still looking at the table. Her hands were flat on her thighs, not clenched, just still. Hayes had the impression she had heard some version of this confirmed before, that Reeve's investigation had briefed her at some point, but that hearing it said plainly in a room with other people present was a different experience from knowing it alone. She's been carrying the weight of a shot that wasn't her error, Hayes said. Yes, Reeve said, she has. For 4 years. For 4 years. Reeve looked at Elena with an expression that was professional and careful, and underneath both of those things contained something that was not professional at all. The file she sent this morning contains the original intelligence package as Soames constructed it, alongside the version that was presented to operational personnel. It also contains communications between Soames and a senior program administrator in which they discuss the package adjustment explicitly. And it contains the internal review findings from the formal investigation that was conducted afterward, which found the discrepancy in recommended action and the directive from above Soames that buried those findings. He paused. That directive was signed by 3 people. 2 of them are still in positions of authority. The file takes all 3, Hayes said. The file takes all 3, Reeve confirmed. Hayes sat with that for a moment. How did she get it? He asked. The original package, Elena said, without looking up, was in a shared operations archive. I had access before I left the program. I pulled it before my access was revoked. She finally looked up. I didn't know what I had at first. I knew the shot was wrong. I spent a year trying to figure out how. When I found the 2 versions of the package, the one Soames built and the one that went to me, I understood what had happened. She looked at Reeve. It took another year to find someone inside the review function who would listen. She came to me 3 years ago, Reeve said. The investigation has been running since then. We needed the paper trail to be complete before we moved. A file from a former operative who left the program under contested circumstances is not sufficient on its own. We needed the communications, the directive, the buried findings. He looked at Hayes. We had most of it, The file she sent this morning contained the directive and the communications, the two things we couldn't access internally because they were held in a personal archive by Soames, which we had authorization to demand but not yet to compel. Why not compel it? Because compelling it required Soames to become a formal subject of the investigation rather than a person of interest, and that step required sign-off from the same senior administrator whose name is on the directive. And that administrator has been very careful about not providing it. Reeve looked at his folded hands. When Soames walked into an active siege to execute a standing extraction order against a former operative, he crossed a line that gave us the formal predicate we needed. He looked at Hayes. You holding him in this compound while she transmitted the file gave us the time to get here. Hayes looked at him. I didn't know that's what I was doing, he said. I know, Reeve said. She did. Hayes looked at Elena. She met his eyes and said nothing. You used me, he said. Not accusingly, just stating a fact that needed to be stated. I put you in a position where you could make your own choices, she said. You made them. Nobody told you to take his documents off the table. Nobody told you to give her 30 minutes on the relay. You did those things because you decided to do them. Without full information. With the information I could give you safely. She held his gaze. I'm sorry it wasn't more. I am. But if Soames had gotten a complete read on what you knew and why you were stalling, he would have handled it differently. The incomplete information was protective. For who? For you, she said. If you didn't know about Reeve, you couldn't be said to be facilitating an unauthorized investigation into a classified program. You were just a commanding officer making judgment calls in a siege. She paused. That's a much better position for you to be in for what comes next. And what comes next? He asked. Reeve answered before Elena could. Formal statements from everyone present during the relevant events, he said. An accelerated review of the Vantage Field Section's operational record going back 6 years. Personnel actions against Soames and the administrator who signed the directive and the 2 others whose names are on the buried findings. He said it with the flat precision of a list he'd been building for 3 years and was now finally able to say out loud. And a formal determination regarding the operation 4 years ago, which will establish for the institutional record that the intelligence failure was a function of deliberate manipulation rather than operator error. The room was quiet again. Hayes looked at Elena. She was looking at Reeve, and she was very still. And Hayes watched her absorb the last thing Reeve had said, with the particular quality of someone absorbing something they've needed to hear for a long time and have stopped believing they would get to hear. Formal determination, she said. Her voice was even, controlled. In writing. In writing, Reeve said, signed, into her operational record, and into the files of the 22. Elena nodded once. She looked at the table. She didn't say anything for a moment, and nobody in the room was going to push her to, and Hayes was aware that the silence had a specific texture to it, the texture of a weight that has been set down after a very long carry, not dropped, not thrown, just set down carefully in a place where it could finally be left. The formal statements took the rest of the morning. Reeve's team moved through the compound with organized efficiency, taking individual accounts from Hayes, from Marsh, from Fenn and Kovacs and Teller, from the soldiers who had been on the east perimeter when Elena came through, from specialist Oren, who had talked to her about wind patterns in the valley before dawn. Each account was recorded, time-stamped, cross-referenced. Soames was interviewed for 2 hours in the operations room. Hayes was not present for that. He didn't need to be. He could tell from the quality of the silence that came through the walls that it was not going well for Soames, and that not going well for Soames was a thoroughly appropriate outcome. Hayes sat in the yard in the thin autumn sunlight that had finally made an appearance after 3 days of rain and drank actual coffee and watched the compound come back to a version of normal. 97 soldiers, all of them accounted for, most of them exhausted, and some of them processing things that would take longer than a morning, and all of them alive in the way that was the whole point. Elena came and sat beside him at some point. She had cleaned up, gotten her arm redressed properly by the medic with actual stitches this time. He could tell because she was holding it differently, the careful way you hold a limb when the wound has been properly closed, and the closure is recent. She had a cup of something that might have been coffee or might have been hot water with aspirations. They sat for a while without talking. 22, Hayes said eventually. Yes, she said. The determination doesn't bring them back. No. She looked at the yard, the soldiers, the light. But their families will know it wasn't. They'll know it wasn't just an operational error that nobody owned. They'll know there was a name on it. She paused. That matters. Does it help? The math? She thought about it honestly, which he appreciated. It changes the direction, she said. It doesn't eliminate the weight. She looked at her cup. I don't think it's supposed to. Hayes nodded. What happens to you now? He asked. Reeves' team will want a full debrief. That takes weeks, maybe longer. After that, she shrugged slightly, which was the first gesture he'd seen her make that was unguarded enough to be called casual. I don't know. I've been operating on a timeline that ended this morning. I haven't thought past it. That sounds uncomfortable, he said. A little, she admitted. He looked at the gate, the south gate, through which a complicated morning had entered and was slowly resolving. For what it's worth, he said, what you did here, the ridge, the shots, the siege, that's its own accounting. Whatever else was happening, you walked through their line and you came back out and 97 people are alive because of it. She was quiet for a moment. For what it's worth, she said, you didn't have to hold the room. You could have given Soames what he wanted. It would have been the easier call. I'm not generally looking for the easier call. I noticed. They sat with that. Marsh came across the yard at a controlled pace that meant he had information that wasn't urgent but was relevant. He stopped in front of Hayes, glanced at Elena, and delivered it in the compressed briefing style that Hayes had grown accustomed to over years of working with him. Reeves' initial interview with Soames is complete, Marsh said. Soames declined to make a full statement but provided enough to confirm Reeves' predicate. They're going to transport him to a secure facility for formal processing. A pause. He also confirmed, apparently without fully intending to, that the administrator who signed the buried directive has been attempting to contact him since this morning, multiple communications, which Reeves' team has now logged as additional evidence of coordination. The administrator is trying to coordinate a story, Hayes said. Was trying, Marsh said. Reeve flagged all incoming communications to Soames's devices about 40 minutes ago. The administrator doesn't know his calls are being recorded. Hayes looked at him. That's very tidy, he said. Reeve seems to be a thorough person, Marsh said. He does. Hayes looked at Elena. Thorough seems to be a theme today. Elena looked at her cup and said nothing, and the corner of her mouth did the thing it had done in the operations room the first night. Not quite a smile, but in the vicinity of one, and slightly more settled than it had been before. At 400, Reeve called Hayes back to the operations room for a final briefing. The room had a different quality now. Soames was gone. His documents were gone. The operative who had pushed toward the communications equipment and been redirected by Marsh with professional economy had given his statement and was sitting with Reeves' team in a vehicle outside, which was not the same as being under formal detention, but was not the same as being free to leave either. Ben was at the map. She'd been there, on and off, all morning, and Hayes had the sense she found the map comforting, something fixed and spatial in a morning that had been neither. Reeves sat at the table. He set a single document in front of Hayes, face down. This is a formal request for a written account of events from 0300 today to present, from you personally, Reeves said. It will be used in the formal review. It will also, and this is the part I want to be clear about, it will also be the document that establishes your conduct during this engagement for any subsequent review of your own record. You're telling me to be thorough, Hayes said. I'm telling you that what you did here today was, depending on the interpretive framework, either a significant overstep of your authority as a field commander or a legitimate exercise of judgment under exigent operational circumstances. Reeve looked at him. The review will apply the framework that the document supports. Write accordingly. Hayes looked at the face-down document. What would you recommend I include? What? He said. Everything, Reeve said, in the order it happened, especially the parts where you made decisions without full information and what you based those decisions on. He paused. Reviewers understand incomplete information. What they have less patience for is incomplete documentation. Hayes turned the document over. He picked up a pen. One question, he said. Go ahead. The operation 4 years ago, the 22 people. He looked up. Is there a name on the formal determination that's going to be visible? Not in the internal record, publicly. Reeve looked at him for a moment. The review findings will be filed under classification, he said. Portions will be released as the review proceedings allow. There are 3 names on the directive that buried the internal findings. Those names are part of the formal record. How much of that record becomes public is a determination for a level above mine. He paused. But the record exists, and records of this type, he chose his next words carefully, tend to find their way. Hayes nodded. He started writing. Reeve stood. He picked up his recorder and his own documents, and he moved toward the door, and he stopped. Commander Hayes, he said. Hayes kept writing. Voss told me, Reeve said, that she wasn't certain you would hold the room. She said she gave you the partial information and made the transmission and did not know until she was outside the wire, whether you'd bought enough time or whether she'd asked too much of someone she'd known for less than 12 hours. Hayes didn't stop writing. She was wrong, he said. She knew. Reeve considered that. Maybe, he said. He left. Hayes wrote for 40 minutes. He wrote everything in the order it happened. The east perimeter, the operations room, the ammunition, the ridge, the shots, the engines in the rain. He wrote Fenn's arrival and Soames's documents and the decision to hold the room. He wrote the radio frequency and the 30 minutes on the relay and the sound of the transmission confirmation in the silence of the operations room. He wrote it plainly, without ornamentation, because plain language was what the document deserved, and because the events themselves didn't need any help being significant. When he was done, he set down the pen. He sat in the operations room that smelled of damp concrete and generator exhaust, and the cold coffee that had been sitting at his elbow since before all of this started, and he thought about what Reeve had said. The record exists, and records of this type tend to find their way. He thought about Elena on the north wall, looking at the valley after the siege broke. He thought about the particular expression she'd worn. Not satisfaction, not relief, something quieter. Something that had been waiting for this specific morning for a long time. He picked up his radio. Marsh. Sir. Where's Voss? A pause that was about 1 beat too long. She was at the South Gate 20 minutes ago, sir, Marsh said, talking to Reeve's team. And now? Another pause. I'll find her, Marsh said. Hayes sat with the radio. He had a feeling, not a certainty, just a feeling, the kind that develops when you have spent enough time reading situations and the people in them, that Marsh was not going to find her at the South Gate and was not going to find her anywhere inside the wire, and that the next time Hayes had any information about Elena Voss's location, it was going to come through channels that had nothing to do with the Keldivar Valley. He sat with that. Then Marsh's voice came back through the radio, and it had the particular quality of confirmed suspicion. Sir, Marsh said, she's gone. The rifle's gone. Reeve's team says she told them she needed to check the perimeter and would be back in 20 minutes. A pause. That was 40 minutes ago. Hayes looked at the window. Outside, the valley was bright and cold and quiet, and the south road was empty, and the ridge to the northeast was just a ridge again, and wherever Elena Voss had gone, she had gone there on her own terms, which was the only way she went anywhere. He should have expected it. He had expected it. He just hadn't known quite when. Log it, he said. She'll surface when she surfaces. He put down the radio. He picked up his completed statement and read it through once, checking it the way you check something that matters. Not looking for what you wanted to say, but for what you actually said, making sure the two things were the same. They were. He set it down. And then the Southgate intercom cracked, and the soldier manning the post said, in a voice that had the particular quality of information that doesn't fit any existing category in the person delivering it, Sir. There's a vehicle on the approach. Military. It's got a flag configuration I don't recognize. And sir, a pause. There's a general in it. The flag on the vehicle was a 2-star configuration. Hayes came through the South Gate on foot and stood in the road while the vehicle pulled up and stopped, and the door opened, and Brigadier General Mara Tollison stepped out onto the gravel of the Keldivar approach road and looked at the compound and then looked at Hayes with the particular directness of a senior officer who has spent considerable time in the field and has stopped performing the version of authority that requires an audience. She was in her late 50s, with a face that the years had worked on without diminishing, and she moved with the economical precision of a person whose body was a tool she maintained rather than a statement she made. She had a single aide with her, who stayed by the vehicle, and she came toward Hayes alone. "Commander Hayes," she said. "General Tolleson," he said. "I wasn't aware you were in this region." "Nobody was," she said. "That was deliberate." She looked at the compound. "How many did you hold with?" 97, ma'am." "Casualties?" "3 wounded during the siege, none critical, none in the final push," he paused. "The siege broke at EO 831. "I know when it broke," she said. "I've been receiving Reeves' reports since AO 700. She looked at him. "Walk me through it." He walked her through it. They stood in the road in the thin afternoon sunlight, and he gave her the condensed operational account, the encirclement, the timeline, the woman who came through the east perimeter, the shots, the engines, Soames and his documents, and the decision to hold the room. He gave it to her in order, without editorializing, the way you give a superior officer an account, when you're not certain yet whether the account is going to be received as a success story or a problem. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "The transmission," she said. "The file." "Yes, ma'am." "You authorized the use of military communications infrastructure for an operation you weren't fully briefed on." "I authorized 30 minutes on the high-band relay for a wounded asset to report her status to her coordinating authority," he said. "That's the documented version." She looked at him. "Is that what happened?" she asked. "It's what I wrote in my formal statement," he said, "which I gave to Reeves' team an hour ago." She studied him for a long moment with the expression of a senior officer who is assessing the precise nature of what she's dealing with. Not whether it's a problem, but what kind of problem, and whether that kind of problem was also the kind of thing that occasionally needed to exist. "Where is she?" Tolleson asked. "She left the compound approximately an hour ago," Hayes said. "She informed Reeves' team she was checking the perimeter." "And she wasn't checking the perimeter." "She was not, ma'am." Tolleson looked at the valley, the ridge to the northeast, the road south. "She'll surface," Tolleson said. "That's what I told Marsh," Hayes said, "because that's what she does." Tolleson looked back at him. "I've known about Elena Voss for 6 years, Commander. I've known about the Vantage program for 4. I've been the senior flag officer on Reeves' oversight brief since its inception." She said it without drama, just establishing the coordinates of her own position in this landscape. "When Reeves' team confirmed the file transmission this morning and confirmed Soames's breach in entering an active combat zone to execute a standing personal order, I drove 4 hours to be here." She paused. "Not for the debrief. Reeve handles the debrief. I came because I want to see the ground she worked." Hayes looked at her. "Why?" he said. "Because what she did on that ridge, the preparation, the engagement, the result, is going to be part of a formal operational review," Tolleson said. "That review will make a determination about whether the engagement was unauthorized and reckless, or whether it was a legitimate tactical action conducted under exigent circumstances by a qualified individual." She held his gaze. "The determination affects her record. It affects what the institutional paperwork says about who she is and what she did." A pause. "I want to see the ground before I make that determination, because I have found in 28 years that people who make determinations without seeing the ground tend to make the wrong ones." Hayes looked at the ridge. "It's about a mile northeast," he said. "The drainage cut is the easiest approach." "Then show me," she said. They walked the ridge together, Hayes and Tolleson, with the aide staying at the vehicle because Tolleson had looked at the aide and looked at the terrain and made a nonverbal decision that the aide processed correctly and accepted without visible objection. The walk took 20 minutes. The drainage cut was still muddy from the rain, and the loose rock traverse was exactly as unpleasant as it had been in the dark, and neither of them commented on the difficulty of it, which was itself a kind of professional communication. At the top, Tolleson stood at the sandbag position that Elena had built and looked at the valley below. She spent a long time looking. "Range to the western node," she said. She estimated 800 meters from her position, Hayes said. "We calculated closer to 850 afterward." "Elevation differential?" "Approximately 40 meters below her." Tolleson crouched and looked through the gap in the sandbags the way you look through a gap when you're trying to understand a firing position. Not to sight anything, but to understand the geometry of what someone saw from this exact point. She stood up. She looked at the mud around the position, at the cold remnants of where a person had lain flat for hours, the compressed earth, and the small depressions where elbows and knees had rested, at the field dressing wrapper that had been dropped, used, and left because there was no time to police the area. At the expended casings, 4 of them, she counted, 3 for the primary targets and 1 for the secondary radio position. 4 shots, she said, 4 targets. In an active enemy adjustment on her position. Yes, ma'am. Tolson looked at the distance from the nearest support. She looked at the exposed flanks on 3 sides. She looked at the trail the enemy fire had walked across the slope below, the scarred earth where impacts had landed short, and then closer, and then close enough, working their way toward a position that had not moved. She stayed in this position, Tolson said, under adjustment fire. Until the 4th target was eliminated, Hayes said. Then she agreed to leave. Agreed, Tolson said, and the word carried a very specific weight. She had a 4th target she hadn't briefed me on, Hayes said. The secondary radio position. She identified it during the engagement and determined that leaving without taking it would have reopened the fire coordination window. He paused. She was right. Tolson was quiet. I came up here, Hayes said, with 2 soldiers. She was bleeding and she was under active fire and she was still in the scope. He said it because it needed to be said plainly, because whoever reviewed the record deserved to have the image in their head when they read the formal language. She told me it would take 2 more minutes. It took about 90 seconds. Another pause. Then she said, okay, and we left. Tolson looked at the valley for a long time. She bent down and picked up one of the expended casings. She looked at it. She set it back down where she'd found it, in the mud beside the sandbags, which was a more deliberate act than it appeared. I'm going to make a determination, she said. Yes, ma'am. It's going to say that the engagement conducted from this position on this date constituted a legitimate tactical action in direct support of the defense of forward base Crimson, carried out by a qualified individual exercising professional judgment under exigent field conditions. She looked at him. It's going to say the outcome: dissolution of the enemy command structure, neutralization of fire coordination capability, direct contribution to the preservation of 97 military personnel, was the result of a deliberate and skilled operational decision, not an unauthorized rogue action. That's accurate, Hayes said. It's also the determination that gives her clean record, Tolson said. The one that sits alongside Reeves' formal finding about the operation 4 years ago. Together, those 2 documents say something about who she is and what she's owed by the institution she served. She looked at him. They don't undo what she's been carrying, but they establish in the permanent record that she carried it for reasons that were never her fault. Hayes looked at the valley. She's not going to be here to receive it, he said. No, Tolson said. She won't. Does that matter? Tolson thought about it. The record exists whether she's in the room or not, she said. The names on the directive that buried the findings exist in the record whether they're in the room or not. That's the point of the record. She started back toward the drainage cut. She knows that. She's known it for 4 years. She was very patient about it. Hayes followed. What happens to Soames? He said. Formal proceedings, Tolson said, picking her way down the rock traverse. The administrator who signed the directive retired 18 months ago, which will make the personal accountability more complicated. But Reeves' team has the communications log from this morning, the calls the administrator made to Soames after the transmission went through. And those communications establish active coordination to suppress the findings, which is a different category than the original decision to bury them. She paused to find a footing on a wet rock. The 2 other names, the ones who signed below the administrator, are still active. One of them will almost certainly cooperate in exchange for a reduced outcome. The other is going to fight it. She reached the bottom of the traverse and kept walking. He'll lose. 4 years, Hayes said. 4 years, she agreed. These things move slowly until they don't. She glanced at him sideways. The file she sent this morning was the thing that made it not slow. Without that, Reeve had enough to proceed, but not enough to move fast. With it, he had enough to act in hours rather than months. She paused. She knew that too. She planned a great deal, Hayes said. She's been planning this for 4 years, Tolson said. The siege just gave her the specific conditions she needed. Did she create the siege? Tolson looked at him. No, she said. The siege was real. The enemy operation was real. A beat. But she knew it was coming. She'd been tracking the group for 3 months. When the encirclement began, she had a choice: pull back to a safe position and wait, or use the conditions as cover for getting inside Reeves' operational window. She looked at the compound ahead. She chose to be useful. She could have been killed, Hayes said. Yes, Tolleson said. That's the part she calculated and accepted. Hayes thought about the math Elena had described. He thought about the direction it ran in. He thought about a person who had been carrying 22 names for 4 years and had found a way to set the weight down that also happened to save 97 people from a siege. And whether that was extraordinary or whether it was simply what a specific kind of person does when they've had 4 years to think about what matters. He thought it was probably both. Reeve was waiting at the south gate. He had a tablet in his hand and an expression that was controlled in the specific way. Controlled expressions look when the news is significant and the person delivering it has decided to let the facts do the work. General, he said to Tolleson. Reeve, she said, talk to me. The administrator, Reeve said. His name is going to be in the formal release. His legal team contacted us 40 minutes ago. He paused. He wants to negotiate. Tolleson looked at him. Negotiate what? She said. The scope of public disclosure, Reeve said. He's willing to provide a full formal account of the directive and the decision to bury the findings in exchange for the public release being limited in specific ways. He wants to control the narrative, Hayes said. He wants to survive it, Reeve said. He looked at Tolleson. My recommendation is that we decline the negotiation. Agreed, Tolleson said. She said it without hesitation, the way you agree to something when the agreement was made before the option was presented. The record goes complete. Reeve nodded. He made a note on the tablet. There's something else, he said. The formal determination on the 4-year operation, the one regarding the intelligence package, is ready for your signature. He handed Tolleson the tablet. She took it. She read it. Actually read it. Not skimmed it. Read every line with the attention of a person who understands that a signature on a document is not a formality, but a commitment, and who treats commitments accordingly. She signed it. She handed the tablet back. The families of the 22, she said. There's a notification process. It's prepared, Reeve said. Personal notifications first, before anything goes into the broader record. That was always the plan. He paused. It will take a few days to reach everyone. Tolleson nodded. She looked at the compound, at the soldiers moving through the yard, visible through the open gate, at the evidence of a position that had been held against significant odds and was now, in the afternoon light, just a place where people were doing the quiet work of coming back to normal. 97, she said, mostly to herself. Yes, ma'am, Hayes said. She looked at him. Your statement, she said. It goes into your record as well. The decisions you made today, holding Soames, the relay access, the determination to go to the ridge, those are in the record as either sound judgment or significant overreach, depending on how this resolves. She held his gaze. It's resolving correctly, which means your record looks like a man who read a complicated situation accurately under pressure and made calls that were defensible and ultimately correct. A pause. That's not nothing. It wasn't about my record, he said. I know, she said. That's what makes it look good in your record. She went inside the compound. At 16:30, Reeves' vehicles departed. Soames was in the third vehicle, which was the one with the reinforced door locks, which was not a coincidence. The operative who had moved toward the communications equipment and had been redirected with professional economy by Marsh was in the fourth vehicle, and his expression when he came through the gate was the expression of a person who has understood that the situation they thought they were in is not the situation they were actually in and is now processing the implications of that. Tolleson departed at 1700 with a handshake for Hayes that lasted slightly longer than a standard professional handshake and communicated something that the handshake format allowed her to communicate without it going into any record. Fenn's team stayed. They would stay for 2 more days, providing coordination support while the logistics of formal relief were arranged, and in those 2 days Hayes worked alongside Fenn with the particular ease of 2 people who have been through a complicated event together and have stopped needing to explain the shorthand. On the second evening, sitting in the operations room with the map that had stopped needing to be stared at now that the situation it represented had resolved, Fenn said something that Hayes had been thinking about without quite articulating. "She's not going to stop," Fenn said. "No," Hayes said. "Whatever she does next, wherever she surfaces, she's not going to stop being what she is." "I know." "Does that bother you?" Hayes thought about it honestly. "No," he said. "The things that need someone like her don't stop existing because the record got corrected." He looked at the map. "She knows that. It's why she left before the paperwork was done." "The paperwork wasn't the point." "What was the point?" "The 22, he said. "And the 97. He paused. "And whatever comes next." Fenn looked at her coffee cup. "You like her," she said. Not accusingly, just observationally. "I respect her," Hayes said. "That's not a denial." "It's not a confirmation either," he said. Fenn almost smiled. "She asked me something," Fenn said. "Before she left. Before she told Reeves' team she was checking the perimeter." She paused. "She asked if I thought you'd be all right. With the record question. Whether the way it resolved would create problems for you downstream." Hayes looked at her. "What did you tell her?" he said. "I told her you'd be fine," Fenn said, "because the outcome supported the decisions, and in this institution, the outcome is what the record reads first." She paused. She seemed relieved. Hayes absorbed that. He thought about Elena on the north wall, looking at the valley after the siege broke. He thought about the particular expression she'd worn, the one that was not satisfaction and not relief, and was something quieter. He understood now that some of that quiet had been about him, about whether what she'd put him in the position to do was going to cost him something he couldn't afford. She had worried about it. She had just not told him. He thought that was very much like her. 3 weeks later, Hayes was at a forward coordination base 800 kilometers from Keldivar, working a planning cycle for a different operation in a different valley, when a physical envelope arrived in the mail distribution with his name on it and no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. On it was a set of coordinates and a date 2 weeks in the future, and the words, in handwriting that was compact and precise and completely consistent with the person he would have expected to write it, North Ridge, different valley. If you're in the area, nothing else. Hayes held the paper for a long time. He looked at the coordinates. He knew the region. It was a long way from where he was currently operating, but not so long that it was impossible. And the date was during a gap in his planning schedule that he had been meaning to fill with administrative catch-up. He put the paper in his pocket. He thought about what Fenn had said. She's not going to stop being what she is. He thought about the record, the determinations, the formal findings, the names that were now in the permanent institutional account. He thought about Soames in a formal proceedings room somewhere, and the administrator's lawyers negotiating a narrative that was not going to go the way the administrator wanted. He thought about 22 families receiving notifications that had taken 4 years to write, and the particular way that kind of notification lands, not as comfort, not exactly, but as something that matters anyway, as a correction that cannot undo the loss but can at least put the truth where it belongs. He thought about 97 soldiers who had gone home. He thought about the math that runs in a direction you can live with. He kept the paper in his pocket for 2 weeks. On the date, in a different valley, he climbed a different ridge. And she was there, exactly where the coordinates said she would be, sitting behind a sandbag position she had built with the same methodical care as the last one, watching a different set of terrain features through a different scope. She didn't look up when he arrived. She knew his footsteps by now, or knew the footsteps of the kind of person who climbed a ridge in the right way, which in her assessment probably amounted to the same thing. "You came," she said. "I was in the area," he said. She looked up at him. He looked at her. She had a fresh cut on her right hand, not deep, the kind you get from moving through terrain too fast in the dark. And there were new lines at the corners of her eyes that might have been there before and he hadn't noticed, or might have been 4 weeks of sleeping rough in the field. She looked like a person who had put down one weight and picked up another one, which was probably accurate. "How's the arm?" he said. "Healed," she said. "Mostly." "Mostly." "There's a ridge in everything," she said. "The arm included." He sat down beside the sandbags and looked out at the valley below. Different from Keldivar, narrower, more forested, a river running through the center that caught the light in the particular way still water catches light in the late afternoon. The record, he said. Toloson's determination. Did it reach you? Reeves sent it, she said, 3 days after. And? She was quiet for a moment. It says what it says, she said. I read it twice. The first time it felt like bureaucratic language about something that was not bureaucratic. She paused. The second time it felt like someone had finally written down what actually happened and put their name on it. Another pause, longer. That's what I needed, not the outcome, just someone writing down what actually happened. Soames's proceedings started, Hayes said. It's going to take 8 months minimum, probably longer. I know. The administrator is not getting the negotiated narrative. Reeve told me. She looked at the valley. He's going to fight it. And lose, Hayes said. Yes, she said. And lose. She was quiet for a while. The families of the 22, she said. Reeves' team reached all of them. I heard. Some of them, a few of them. They wanted to know why it took 4 years. She said it with the specific care of someone choosing words in an area that is still raw. I don't have a good answer for that. The true answer is that institutions move slowly until they have to move fast, and nobody made them have to move fast until recently. She looked at her hands. I keep going back to whether there was something I could have done sooner. A different approach. An earlier moment. You did what you could with what you had, Hayes said. That's what people say, she said. It's not always comforting. No, he agreed. It's not. He looked at the valley. But it's also true. She didn't respond immediately. Then she said, 53 days. What? From the moment I found the 2 versions of the intelligence package to the moment I understood what it meant. 53 days. That's how long it took me to know what I was looking at. She looked at the valley. After that, everything moved as fast as it could move. I went to Reeve. I built the timeline. I kept the files safe. I waited for the conditions to align. She paused. 53 days I didn't know. Everything after that was as fast as I could make it. Hayes nodded. Then that's the answer to the families, he said. 53 days, and then as fast as she could make it. She looked at him. Something in her face shifted in a way that was not dramatic. Not tears, not a visible break in the composure she carried as a default condition. Just a small, involuntary softening in the area around her eyes. A momentary drop in the careful maintenance of the expression she wore. And then it was back. But he'd seen it. Thank you, she said. It came out quietly, without the careful flatness that most of her speech carried. I didn't do anything, he said. You held the room, she said. That was self-interest, he said. I wanted the outcome. Most people want outcomes, she said. Not everyone holds the room to get there. They sat on the ridge as the light changed. Below them, the valley moved through its afternoon rhythms, birds, wind, the river catching and releasing the late sun. There was no siege below them today. There was no enemy positioning, no command structure to map, no math that required the particular calculus Elena carried. Just a valley being a valley in the late afternoon, and 2 people sitting above it with the particular ease of people who have been through something together and have stopped needing to fill the silence. At some point, the light began to go. She started packing the position down. Sandbags moved, the scope put away, the rifle in its drag bag with the same methodical care as always. Hayes helped without being asked and without making it a thing. They worked in the practiced quiet of people whose different sets of professional habits happened to be compatible. When everything was packed, she stood and looked at the valley one more time. Where next? He said. East, she said. There's a situation developing that nobody official is going to move on for another 3 weeks, and 3 weeks is too long. Is it your situation to move on? She looked at him. Someone has to, she said. He thought about that. He thought about what Toloson had said. She's not going to stop being what she is. And about the accuracy of that, and about whether accuracy was the same as acceptance. He thought it probably was. East is a large direction, he said. I'll send coordinates, she said. She picked up the rifle. She looked at him one more time, a direct, brief look, the kind that carries information without language, the specific vocabulary of people who have been in the same bad light together and know each other's faces at a level that precedes words. Then she turned and walked down the ridge, into the trees, into the failing light, and he stood at the position she'd built and watched her go until the forest took her. He stood there for a while after. He thought about the record, about 2 documents now in a permanent institutional file, the tactical determination from Tolleson and the operational finding from Reeve, sitting alongside each other and saying, together, in the flat language of official accountability, that a specific person had done a specific thing for the right reasons and had been failed by the people who should have seen that, and that the failure was documented and named and owned. He thought about 22 families who now had a version of the truth that was not comfort, but was something. And about 97 soldiers who had gone home to people who didn't know how close the math had come to running differently. He thought about a woman who measured the distance before she crossed it, because she was already planning the return trip, who talked about wind patterns for 20 minutes with a specialist from 40 kilometers away because she cared about conditions that hadn't happened yet, who sat in a compound operations room and drank cold coffee and said, "Not an army, their confidence," and meant it, and was right. He thought about carrying something for a long time and finding the right place to set it down. He thought about what it cost and what it built, and the difference between those 2 things, which was not always clear in the moment, but which usually became clear eventually, if you kept going long enough and made the next decision when the next decision needed to be made. He picked up his kit. He walked down the ridge. Behind him, the valley held its light for a few minutes more, the way valleys do at the end of the day, catching and keeping the last of it before the dark came in from the east, and the hills went quiet, and the river ran on in the dark toward somewhere it hadn't been yet. The record would say what it said, the names would be in it, the 97 would go on living, and somewhere east, in a situation that nobody official was going to move on for 3 more weeks, a woman with a rifle and a 4-year patience and a precise understanding of the distance between where she was and where she needed to be was already measuring the ground. There are people who carry the weight of what went wrong for years, not because they can't let go, but because they refuse to let the wrong thing be the last word. They don't wait for someone to hand them justice. They build the conditions for it, one careful step at a time, and they keep moving forward even when the moving forward costs them everything except the direction. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, the whole thing.